Why, hello there. Today we're going to talk about a couple books that we've touched on slightly before. One of them was from my March of 2025 reading. That book is called Technofeudalism by Yanis Varoufakis, and that was published in February of 2024. The second book we're going to read or talk about is Surveillance Capitalism, which I touched upon briefly in my discussion on Read, Write, Own, and that is by Shoshana Zuboff, and that was published in March of 2020. One of the things that I kept thinking about while I was reading Surveillance Capitalism is this kind of tension between surveillance capitalism and technofeudalism, because Varoufakis did bring up surveillance capitalism, and he kind of tried to refute it with his book because he didn't really think that it really delivered on its theory for everything that's been happening with technology. And I kind of actually had the opposite idea, whereas I was reading Surveillance Capitalism, I thought that this explains so much that technofeudalism just didn't explain. It didn't explain why these companies pivoted in a lot of the ways they did. However, I watched the beginning of a video from Jared Henderson discussing why the internet's getting worse. I'll link it up here. And he brings up the topic of enshittification. And I've written about enshittification before. I think it's a very powerful idea. I think it really does do a good job of outlining the steps. And in Read, Write, Own, he describes it as the attract, extract. And you could say that there's multiple phases of attract, extract, where you just change from users to business customers. But I think that the surveillance capitalism and technofeudalism really provide a solid theoretical underpinning to Cory Doctorow's enshittification theory. So here's what Doctorow says. Here's how platforms die. First, they are good to their users. Then they abuse their users to make things better for their business customers. Finally, they abuse those customers to claw back all the value for themselves. What I think is going on is from surveillance capitalism is a through line from beginning to end. I think it actually starts out somewhat innocently, where part of making things good for users is actually a little bit of surveillance. And I'll explain why I think that in a minute. And then whenever you start making things better for business customers, that's whenever you slide into technofeudalism. And then those business customers start becoming digital serfs. And as they become more abusive, that's whenever they become digital lords and start dominating the people and abusing their business customers to extract as much value from them as possible. So I think surveillance capitalism really starts at the beginning, and I thought this book was fantastic. It had a lot of really interesting ideas, and the reason why I think that this book is a major through line is that with web testing and a lot of product testing, you add instrumentation to it. And the instrumentation is there so that you can understand what's happening in your customer's environment, how the customer is using the technology. If they're on a website, you can actually create little tags so that you know whenever a user interacts with it. And because of test platforms like Selenium, you can actually leverage those tags to create programmatic interfaces to trigger things in certain ways, to try and break things so that you can make sure that doesn't happen whenever a customer is using it, so that you can measure how long it takes for something to happen. You can measure the click rate on certain parts of your website so you can understand what is working and what's not. And so that initial surveillance, I would argue, is a positive surveillance because it's there for measuring things to improve things. But it can really easily slide into trying to drive behavior, because once you start to know what the behavior is happening on your page, so you can start asking, how do I modify this? And one of the ways that you can modify that is by doing A/B testing. And A/B testing is the most basic of any sort of behavioral modification. You are trying to figure out what are the best ways to modify your customer's behavior to do something you want. So a customer comes to your website and you want them to get more information. So you have a couple different splash screens whenever they load up and says, that has different copy, and try to determine which one gets people to go to the next step where they get more information. And then you continue that experiment where you try to figure out what gets more people to actually sign up for your process, give you information, and then which one actually gets them to pay. Each one of those is a step that transitions from surveillance to exploitation and behavior modification. And a lot of these things are really a gradient. It's really easy to go from one to the other. I mean, it's easy for example, my company, we capture information about Wi-Fi environments. And if we have a mechanism to capture that information from real-time use, we can start getting a picture of what everybody's Wi-Fi environment is like. In fact, you can look at one of the things that is brought up by Zuboff is Google's surveillance with their map technology, where they would go and they were just probably somewhat innocently, is there Wi-Fi around here? Is there open Wi-Fi around here that I could leverage? They probably started that for themselves. And then it went from how can I leverage this for myself to, well, how can we track all of this, and how can we store this, and how can we make this publicly available for everybody because people will want it. But it's also a sort of surveillance and informational gathering because people put weird information in their SSIDs for their Wi-Fi. And at that point, you start to transition from a purely telemetry to a pure surveillance and behavior modification. And I think this is where Zuboff kind of loses me a little bit with her book. I don't think it was bad necessarily, but I think it took away from the punch and focus of these things are bad, to kind of going off and having a discussion with her old PhD advisor, B.F. Skinner, who really did do a lot of work on behavioralism, that is kind of the grandfather of a lot of this behavior that informed economists that like Thaler that went into nudge analysis, and then Pentland, who's kind of the current high priest of adding surveillance to everything to drive different behaviors. And she spends an entire chapter, probably 50 to 100 page chapter, critiquing these folks and how bad this is for users. I actually think that surveillance capitalism would have been served better by taking that section out and actually publishing it now, where we have things like OpenAI and Grok, and where all this data has been pushed into this machine learning system that is being used to replace employees en masse in journalism and all that, where it's like the consumption of all this surveillance capitalism in all these forms is being leveraged to just minimize cost of labor. And really, any company that starts capturing data is going to figure out how to leverage it. There's going to be some sort of digital transformation where some consultant group will come in and say, oh, you have all this data. Let's see what else we can do with it. How can we mine it? How can we use this to sell the data? What can we sell to third parties? What can we keep internally so that we can try and use that information to sell another product or build a new product for those customers? Or how can we use this data to try and sell advertisements, because a lot of things are built off of advertisements. And that's what Google and Facebook have done. How can we figure out where to position the ads? And that's where the telemetry of where is my user's cursor? Where are they looking the most? Which cursor is a representation of that? And you can do studies where if you get access to the webcam, you can literally see where they're looking on their website, on there, because you can calculate the direction from where the webcam is, if you know where it is, and so you can develop heat maps of where people are looking and where people are spending the time. And that's why you can see advertisements move from the far right to the very top. And you can see that like with Google, the top half dozen or dozen search results are now all ads. But then they started to put their own LLM AI stuff on top, which is now the Technofeudalism part, where you could say that Google used to do a service for brands like the New York Times, because you could search and get easy access to news stories. You could search, president who choked on a pretzel, and it would come up with a New York Times article about George W. Bush choking on a pretzel. But now you would get advertisements above that could point to some news aggregate site that would link to other sites, and so that they could get ad revenue. And then now Google's putting at the very top a summary of that New York Times article, and not even burying the New York Times article and talking about some commentary around people sending pretzel bags to the White House afterwards as a form of protest. That's all the techno-feudalism side of things. And I think that there are some better examples that I really remember from whenever I used to be on Facebook. Zynga was a really popular company that was built on top of Facebook, where they had like Farmville and Mobville or something, Mob Wars, I think it was, and that was all explicitly surveillance capitalism. Everybody knew that. Everybody knew people were collecting it because they explicitly had to ask. They got your entire network. They really encouraged you to push things to your network. And eventually it became a problem for Facebook because so many posts were just people saying, sign up for Mob Wars or sign up for Farmville so I can milk my cow faster. And Facebook really cracked down, and they basically destroyed Zynga for a while. And they kicked them off the platform in a lot of ways. And that really was like the first sign of a wake-up call for the digital surf. But all of that still includes surveillance capitalism. Like Zynga was making money because of surveillance capitalism. But they were still living and dying at the whim of Facebook. And users were just being exploited. And that led into the Cambridge Analytica, and Cambridge Analytica was eventually kicked off. That became a digital surf. So I think that's why we need to be looking at surveillance capitalism and techno-feudalism as just a gradient of where things are in the process and who that specific person is. I think it's clearer on a site like YouTube, because you have surveillance capitalism, people watching videos. You have surveillance capitalism around the people who are making the videos and all the information about that, how long they are, the types of things they cite, where they're referenced. There's analytics around the the way that thumbnails are working, and you become a member of the surveillance community because you're watching and trying to see who's watching and who's not, and what's getting more views and all of that. You're encouraged to become a member of the surveillance community. But you're still a digital serf. You're still controlled by the whims of YouTube and Google and advertisers. And advertisers are still at the whim of Google, and they're still digital serf. So there's kind of this nesting doll of surveillance and feudalism kind of bouncing back and forth in these modes. And all of it is just enshittification. Everything is worse the whole way down because the users are surveilled. Your recommendations are driven to try and drive you to stay on the platform longer. You're a digital serf because you're providing value to Facebook, no matter how or not Facebook, to Google, no matter how you're using it. As a content creator, you're a digital serf that is being exploited by advertisers, and then the advertisers are being exploited and controlled by Google. Because a perfect example of this is the various adpocalypses that have happened on YouTube. There was a recent one where that happened, where if you didn't have chapters or pauses within your videos that were natural, that mid-rolls could be placed in without interfering with the flow of content, you don't get mid-rolled ads. And I remember Real Civil Engineer, one of the channels that I watch, he talked about how that change, because he does video games. All video games usually are you just play through, and there's a flow, there's a story that's being told, and it works better without having chapters. And so he lost a quarter of his revenue because there's no more mid-roll ads for his videos. It was only at the beginning and at the end. And so that was really catastrophic, but it also would have hit the ad companies, because now all of a sudden those people are not getting all these ads and not getting the clicks and the views and all of that happen in the mid-roll. And so there's kind of like a multi-layer feudalism that's going on, where multiple people are being hurt at the same time and are being exploited. And supposedly it's supposed to improve, how long the user is on it. But, maybe the user experience is better, maybe it's worse. I think that all these kind of are show it's not one or the other. It's a gradient between surveillance capitalism, technofeudalism, and ultimately they both are the theoretical underpinning that really explain enshittification. I think I'm going to leave it there. I really recommend surveillance capitalism. I do think that there's a part that's a bit of a drag. I kind of think you could skip it, or read it with a different context, like around OpenAI, or read it in context with something like 1984. I might go and read Walton 2. I've never read it, and maybe kind of do that comparison between these books together. I think Technofeudalism was also interesting. I wasn't a big fan of the cloudalists instead of, which is the capitalists and cloud providers. I think that surveillance capitalism was an impetus to become a cloud company, and then technofeudalism became the impetus for extracting wealth out of the cloud. So I think that these are all gradients, and I really do think that together these two ideas explain why we're in this enshittification mode. So I want to thank Jared for, not that he knows who I am, but for getting me to think about this idea in this context of enshittification, and that these are really just different periods of time, and that a lot of companies are going to go through this gradient, and there's good theoretical underpinnings for these ideas now. So I want to thank you so much for watching. If you have any thoughts about this, if you agree with me, disagree, I'd really love to hear your opinion. Do you think that enshittification is bullshit? Do you think technofeudalism's right? Do you think surveillance capitalism's right? Do you think they're all dumb? Do you think we're just a bunch of idiots trying to come up with a theory around this? Let me know. Please subscribe. It really helps the channel out. And if you have any recommendations on what to read next or what you would like me to see, like me to discuss, I'd really appreciate that. And I hope you have a good one.